She was 32 years old, and she had been left for dead. That was the plain fact of it, spoken the way her father had always insisted facts be spoken, without decoration and without apology, because a truth that needed softening was usually a truth that someone with power preferred you not to know. The man who left her was Leland Pruitt, the county sheriff of Rimstone, Montana Territory, and he had done it with a careful, unhurried competence that told her, lying in the cold mud beneath the crumbling southern wall of abandoned Fort Harrow in the late autumn of 1883, that he had done something like this before and had never once been asked to account for it. She had gone to the fort at his suggestion, following what he had told her was evidence in the land dispute that had consumed the last 4 months of her life, and instead found darkness and a blow that dropped her like a stone against the fort's old foundation stones. She had $4 in her coat pocket when she fell, a dead father's surveying compass in her right hand, and, as she discovered sometime in the small cold hours of the morning when she finally recovered enough consciousness to understand what her fingers were touching, something pressed into the gap between 2 foundation stones directly beside her face that had been there a very long time, and that the fall, and the cold, and the particular angle at which she had come to rest against that wall, had positioned her to find in a way that no one standing upright ever would have. What she found in that gap, sealed in wax cloth and pressed flat against stone that had been absorbing Montana winter since before the territory had its current name, would not only return Nora Vance to the living, but would finally give Rimstone the answer to the question its oldest families had spent 30 years ensuring no one survived long enough to ask. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Vance. If you have ever had the truth pressed into your hands at the exact moment the world decided it was finished with you, tell us in the comments, because this story is for you tonight. Nora had grown up understanding the land in the specific, technical way of a surveyor's daughter, which is to say she understood it not as scenery or sentiment but as a system of measurements and relationships, of bearings and distances and elevations that, recorded accurately and honestly, constituted a kind of argument against the various lies that people with power told about where one thing ended and another began. Her father, Clement Vance, had come to the Montana Territory in 1860 with a transit and a chain and a federal surveying commission, assigned to the systematic work of establishing the official boundaries of a territory that was, at that moment, primarily theoretical in its organization. A vast and largely unmapped country that existed in legal documents as a series of coordinates and in actual fact as something considerably more complicated and more beautiful and more contested. Clement was not a man of many words, but he was a man of exact ones, and the language he used most fluently was the language of recorded measurement, of field notes and plat maps and corner monuments that said, with the authority of federal law and the precision of good instruments, here is where one man's claim ends and another's begins. He taught Nora this language from the time she could hold a pencil, bringing her into the field as soon as she was old enough to carry the rod without dropping it, and she absorbed the work with a naturalness that he attributed, in his quiet, undemonstrative way, to her having inherited her mother's patience and her grandfather's spatial sense, 2 qualities that made the trade's genuine demands feel less like labor and more like a particularly satisfying form of attention. Her mother, Ida, had been the daughter of a schoolteacher from Ohio who had come west with the particular, determined hopefulness of educated women of that era who understood that the frontier, whatever else it was, represented a loosening of certain Eastern constraints on what a woman might reasonably do with her intelligence. Ida had taught school in Rimstone for 3 years before she married Clement, and she continued, after the marriage, to keep the small lending library she had established in the back room of the surveying office, a collection of perhaps 200 volumes that she updated annually from a bookseller in St. Louis and that served, for a considerable portion of Rimstone's population, as the primary evidence that the intellectual life available in the territory was not entirely confined to what the saloon and the land office between them provided. She died of a difficult childbirth when Nora was 16, taking the child with her, and the loss left the Vance household quieter and more self-contained than it had previously been, Clement retreating further into his field notes and Nora taking over the library's maintenance with a devotion that was partly her mother's inheritance and partly the particular focus of a grief that needed somewhere honest to go. There was, in Clement Vance's approach to his trade, a philosophy that Nora absorbed so completely across the years of her girlhood that she could not, by the time she was grown, clearly distinguish it from her own natural way of moving through the world. He believed, with the settled conviction of a man who had spent 20 years watching the consequences of dishonest survey work ripple outward through communities and across generations, that a measurement falsified for someone's convenience in the present became an injustice compounded by time into the future, that every corner monument set in the wrong place was a small lie told to the ground itself, and that the ground, unlike the people who stood on it, kept its own honest record regardless of what the official documents claimed. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a just one, and the distinction mattered to Nora more than she could have articulated as a child and more than she needed to articulate as an adult, because it lived in her hands the same way her mother's patience lived in her hands, as a quality of the doing rather than the saying. It was from this inheritance, this precise, morally weighted attention to what the ground actually said rather than what anyone preferred it to say, that Nora had drawn, in the autumn of 1883, when she discovered among her father's files a boundary challenge he had been preparing at the time of his death, the particular steadiness that allowed her to continue the work after he was gone rather than setting it aside as someone else's unfinished business. The challenge concerned the eastern flat of the Rimstone Valley, a stretch of exceptionally productive agricultural ground that was currently operating as part of the Drummond Land and Cattle Company's holdings and that her father's resurvey had established was encroaching, by a margin he had documented to the rod across 400 acres. On the registered claims of 3 ranching families who had been quietly losing ground to that encroachment for the better part of a decade without understanding precisely what was happening or having the technical means to prove it. Clement had understood both things, had done the work necessary to establish the proof, and had died before he could file it, leaving the filing for the daughter who had learned his trade at his side and who possessed, therefore, not merely the will to pursue his work but the competence to do it honestly. The fall had come in stages, as falls in that country so often did, each one arriving before she had fully absorbed the preceding one. The first stage was her father's death itself, which happened in late June of 1883 from a stroke that took him in the field, his body found by a neighboring rancher's hand the following morning with his transit still set up on its tripod and his field notes open to the day's last recorded observation, a detail that Nora found, in its own way, more comforting than any formal farewell might have been, because it confirmed what she had always believed about him, that his work and his life were so thoroughly the same thing that ending one had simply ended the other in the same moment. The second stage was the discovery, in the weeks following the funeral, that her father's surveying license had been registered to him personally and did not transfer to a female heir under the current territorial statutes, a legal finding she spent 2 weeks verifying through correspondence with the Territorial Land Commissioner before accepting as accurate and unappealable by any means available to her. This meant that to continue the boundary challenge, she would need to engage a licensed surveyor to co-sign the filing, which she did, at considerable personal expense, securing the services of a competent man from the next county who reviewed her father's work, confirmed its findings, and agreed to lend his license to the submission. The third stage, and the one that produced the evening at Fort Harrow, was what happened after the filing was submitted. The County Land Office denied the challenge on procedural grounds within 2 weeks, grounds that the Territorial Commissioner confirmed were technically valid in their application but unusual in the speed and completeness of their deployment against a first submission. The engaged surveyor withdrew from the matter shortly thereafter, citing a reconsideration of professional circumstances that arrived in the form of a letter whose apologetic tone barely concealed the nature of the pressure that had produced it. And then, in the second week of November, Sheriff Leland Pruitt had appeared at the surveying office door with his patient manner and his offer of material evidence and his suggestion that Fort Harrow, specifically its eastern foundation, contained federal survey documents from the original territorial mapping that would settle the boundary question in her favor beyond any procedural challenge. She had gone, which was the decision she turned over most carefully in the cold hours after she woke beneath the wall, not with regret but with the forensic attention her father had taught her to bring to any question whose answer needed to be precise rather than comfortable. She had gone because Pruitt was the county sheriff and because the evidence he described was exactly what the challenge needed, and because she had not yet fully understood that a man who has spent 15 years being useful to Fletcher Drummond does not, one November evening, spontaneously become useful to a 32-year-old woman with a dead father's files and a pending land challenge instead. She understood it now. And she had $4, and a compass, and something sealed in wax cloth that her fingers had found in the gap between the third and fourth foundation stones from the ground, and she was going to need to be able to stand before the gap between understanding and doing anything about it could close. She stood, eventually, and walked, and arrived at the door of Mathilde Prentice before the sky had decided what color it intended to be that morning. Mathilde was 71 years old and had been her mother's closest friend in Rimstone, and she opened the door without asking why and put a kettle on without commenting on the mud or the dried blood at the back of Nora's head, in the particular, practical way of women who have lived long enough that the range of things that can arrive at a door before dawn no longer surprises them. It was at Mathilde's kitchen table, with the cast iron stove speaking quietly to itself in the corner and the oil lamp throwing its yellow patience across everything, that Nora opened the wax cloth packet and began to understand, for the first time, the full shape of what had happened in Rimstone long before she or her father or any of the 3 ranching families on the eastern flat had arrived to become part of its consequence. What would you expect to find inside a packet sealed into a military fort's foundation wall sometime in the early 1860s, pressed there by hands unknown and in circumstances she had not yet begun to fully imagine? Whatever your answer, we can tell you that what Nora found at Mathilde Prentice's kitchen table in the grey November pre-dawn was not treasure in any ordinary sense, and not a map to something buried, and not any of the things that sealed documents in old walls and stories tend to contain, but something whose value was of a different and considerably more consequential kind, a value measured not in what it was worth to any individual but in what it meant to the specific community of Rimstone, Montana Territory, and to the 6 farming families whose disappearance from the valley's history had been, for 30 years, one of those carefully managed absences that small and powerful communities learn to maintain through the shared discipline of simply never speaking the absent names aloud. The packet contained 11 sheets of paper, covered in a small, precise handwriting that identified itself on the first sheet's opening lines as the account of Corporal James Elias Drum, 3rd Infantry, United States Army, written at Fort Harrow in the spring of 1862 and placed in this wall, as the corporal explained in his careful opening paragraph, because he had reason to believe he would not survive to deliver it by hand, and because the account it contained was one that he understood. With the clarity of a man who has watched powerful people arrange events to their own benefit, would not find a friendly reception through the fort's official channels, given that the commanding officer had been a guest of the Aldrich family at their Rimstone holdings on 3 of the preceding 4 weekends and had given no indication that this arrangement troubled his professional judgment in any particular. The Aldrich family. Nora looked up from the page and met Mathilde's eyes across the table, and Mathilde, who had been reading over her shoulder with the quiet intentness of a woman who understood that some documents required a witness, held her gaze with an expression that confirmed, without words, that the name meant something she recognized, and that what it meant was not comfortable, and that she had suspected something of this nature for a very long time without ever having the factual basis to say precisely what she suspected. The Aldrich family had been Rimstone's founding family, and their most prominent living descendant, through the maternal line, was Fletcher Drummond, who had taken his stepfather's name when that name proved a more convenient inheritance, and who owned the Drummond Land and Cattle Company, and who sat on the County Board of Commissioners, and whose holdings on the Eastern Flat were the specific subject of the boundary challenge that had brought Leland Pruitt to Nora's door with his offer of evidence and his careful, unhurried manner. Corporal Drum's 11 pages described, with the forensic specificity of a man who had been present and who had understood that precision was the only form of protection available to him, what had happened in the autumn of 1852 to the 6 Mennonite farming families who had settled the eastern flat of the Rimstone Valley 3 years before that date and had built, through patient and genuine agricultural labor, the most productive grain operation in the territory's eastern reaches. They had been there. They had worked that land honestly. And then, in the winter of 1852, following a series of arrangements between Cornelius Aldrich and the fort's commanding officer of that era, they had ceased to be a presence in the valley, their departure managed in such a way that no subsequent inquiry by any territorial authority had produced a clear account of what had become of them, and the land they had farmed had passed through a series of transfers whose documentation had been carefully prepared by men who understood what documentation needed to say, into Aldrich ownership, and had remained in that family's control, under various names and corporate arrangements, across 3 generations and to the present day. The account named names. It recorded dates. It described the specific conversations Drum had witnessed, the specific orders he had been given that he had declined to carry out fully and that had marked him, he believed, for the transfer order that had been prepared for him. A transfer he had escaped only by going to ground in the fort's most remote section and subsequently resigning his commission under circumstances the record described as voluntary and that Drum's account described, in his final paragraph, somewhat differently. He had sealed the account in the wall because the wall was his, or as close to his as anything in that country was, and because he had built that section of foundation himself in his first year at the fort and knew its every stone, and because he trusted stone more than he trusted the men in his chain of command, which the events of the preceding year had given him ample reason to do. Fletcher Drummond came to Matilde Prentice's house the following morning, which told Nora that Leland Pruitt had reported to him before she had done anything at all, and that the interval between the previous night's events and the current morning's visit had been spent in the particular, efficient preparation of men who are accustomed to managing inconveniences before they become publicly visible. Fletcher was 63 years old and wore his age with the deliberate ease of someone who has never been seriously challenged and has therefore never needed to develop the musculature that genuine challenge produces, and he arrived at Matilde's door in his good morning coat with a composed expression that told Nora, before he had spoken a word, that he believed the situation was still manageable and that the management would take its usual form. The offer, when it came, was money, a sum that acknowledged without stating it that something had happened the previous night that ought not to have happened, framed as a settlement of her father's land challenge and a resolution of her difficult circumstances, requiring in return her signature on a withdrawal of the boundary challenge and a transfer to the Drummond Company of the surveying files from her father's office. She listened to it in its entirety, sitting at Matilde's kitchen table with her hands folded over the oilcloth and the wax packet nowhere visible, because Matilde had placed it inside the flour canister the previous night with the calm practicality of a woman who understood that the most important things in a contested situation are always the ones the other party does not know you still hold. When Fletcher finished, Nora told him she would need several days to consider, and he accepted this with a grace that had a measured patience built into it, the patience of a man who has not yet run out of methods but is beginning to feel the edges of the ones available. She spent those days doing three things. The first was producing, in her own hand, 3 complete transcriptions of Corporal Drum's 11 pages, which she sent by separate postal routes to the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Helena, the Territorial Attorney General's office, and a newspaper correspondent in Buena Vista whose name she had encountered in her father's files and whose published reporting on territorial land matters she had read enough of to trust his accuracy and his willingness to print what was true regardless of whose name it implicated. The second was securing, through Matilde's considerable network of long acquaintance, the names and locations of any surviving descendants of the 6 families who had settled the Eastern Flat in the late 1840s, a search that produced, after 2 days of careful inquiry conducted through letters and a telegram, a woman named Greta Scholl living in Billings, whose grandmother had been the youngest surviving member of one of the 6 families and who had spent her adult life in the particular unresolved grief of someone who knew that something had been done to her family and had never had the factual basis to say with precision what it was. The third was providing, to the federal investigator who arrived in Rimstone 18 days after her letters had been sent, a complete and precise account of everything, including the name of the sheriff who had left her beneath the fort wall and the specific nature of what she had found there, delivered in the same level, exact voice her father had used when presenting survey findings before a commissioner he needed to be entirely clear. The investigation took 4 months, which was not swift but was, given the depth of what it eventually reached, considerably shorter than Nora had allowed herself to expect. The Drummond Land and Cattle Company's title to the Eastern Flat was voided by federal order in the spring of 1884, the fraudulent origin of its founding established through Corporal Drum's account and corroborated by 2 additional sources the federal investigators located in the course of their work. Leland Pruitt was removed from his position and faced proceedings that were pursued with considerably more vigor than was typical for such cases, an atypicality Nora attributed to the Buena Vista correspondent, whose reporting proved both accurate and prominent enough to make the usual local mechanisms of protection unavailable. Fletcher Drummond faced no criminal charges, since the law's reach across acts committed a generation before his own birth was limited by both statute and evidence, but the Drummond Company's dissolution and the federal findings' public entry into the territorial record accomplished, in the particular economy of a small Montana community, something that a fine could not have produced, a permanent and public accounting of exactly how the valley's dominant family had come to be dominant, which was a kind of reckoning that Fletcher experienced, for the remainder of his life, as something considerably more uncomfortable than any sentence a court might have imposed. Greta Scholl, who was 61 years old and had not returned to the Montana Territory since her childhood departure, came to Rimstone in the summer of 1884 to attend the federal proceedings that formally recognized the historical claims of her family's community, and she sat in the county courthouse in a plain gray dress with her hands folded and listened while a federal clerk read Corporal Drum's account into the official record, and when the reading was finished she sat a moment longer before she rose and thanked the clerk by name for reading it clearly. She and Nora took a meal together that evening at Matilde Prentice's kitchen table, and what they talked about was not the past's injustice, which had been addressed as fully as the living could address what the dead had suffered, but the future's possibilities, which included a land trust for the Eastern Flat family's descendants, funded by the federal settlement and administered by a board that included, at the commissioner's specific recommendation, a licensed surveyor whose credibility in the territory had been substantially enhanced by recent events. We come back, at the end of every story, to the moment of beginning, because that is where the clearest truth is available, before the complication of events has had a chance to make the simple things seem complex. Nora Vance had been left for dead beneath a fort wall with $4 in her pocket and her father's compass in her hand, and what the people who left her there had not accounted for was not her survival alone, though they ought to have ensured it more carefully, and not the document in the wall, whose existence they apparently did not know about, but the particular quality of attention that her father had spent 30 years teaching her to bring to any ground she was standing on, the quality that insists on knowing what is actually there before allowing any conclusions about what it means. She had applied that quality to a gap in a stone wall in the cold dark before dawn, the same quality she had been applying to the Eastern Flats boundary since she found her father's unfinished filing, and she had found in that gap what Corporal James Elias Drum had placed there 20 years before she was born. Trusting not that a specific person would find it but that the kind of person who would know what to do with it would eventually come along and the wall would hold it until she arrived. It had held. She had arrived. And the thing that needed doing had been done in the patient, methodical, legally documented way her father had always insisted was the only way anything important got done permanently, and the Eastern Flat was on its way back toward the families it had always been meant to belong to, and Rimstone, Montana would never again be entirely comfortable with the story it had told itself about its own beginning. She thought about Corporal Drum sometimes, in the years that followed, in the quiet way she thought about her father, as someone she had never met who had nonetheless shaped the contours of her life through the quality of the attention he had brought to a situation that asked more of him than most people in his position would have found available. She thought about the fort wall, still standing at the valley's edge, its southern section intact and its foundation stones as solid as the day they were laid, and she thought about the gap between the third and fourth stones from the ground, which was empty now and which would hold nothing further, because some purposes are completed and do not need to be replaced, and because the truth that had waited there for 20 years had finally found the hands it had been waiting for and had done through those hands, what it had always been meant to do. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight, and with Nora, and with the soldier who sealed his conscience into a stone wall and trusted the wall to hold. If this story reached something in you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to be reminded that the truth, properly preserved, has a longer life than the people who try to bury it. And we would love to know, what is a time in your own life when something found or given to you in a moment of great difficulty turned out to hold far more than you could have imagined when you first reached for it? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, stay close.